What I'm talking about today is kind of, in a lot of ways, the product of three of the Northwest universities. I started working on literary geography in my PhD. I was working with Ian Gregory on a GIS in the humanities project as my postdoc. Oops. And then this is the work that I'm finishing up as part of the fellowship at Manchester. So for a lot of humanities scholars, digital approaches continue to seem antithetical to the kind of nuanced close reading that characterises our disciplines. And literary scholars in particular have expressed particular anxieties about what's lost when digital approaches are applied to textual analysis. They've worried, and not without justification, I don't think, that when we focus on a corpus rather than on an individual text, that we lose fundamental understandings of how literature works, and maybe more seriously for the literary scholar, how it feels. A danger with using a technology like a geographical information system to read the spatial data provided by written texts is that it risks reducing the significance of the individual text in preference for the larger corpus, or that it risks privileging distant reading over the close reading that continues to underpin literary studies. But what I want to explore in the next 20 minutes is how a geohumanist approach to GIS that emphasises playfulness and creative responses to sources, how that kind of approach might be used to negotiate what on the Geospatial project we called a multi-scalar approach to literary analysis that combines distant with close reading in a more cohesive structure than has perhaps been the case before. So what I want to do today is to offer an overview of the development of this kind of work in the last couple of years, especially the challenges faced by literary scholars who have wanted to use GIS for literary analysis, and then to use the Geospatial Innovation project as a case study for how we might try and address some of those issues. So for scholars like Joanna Taylor, the very term digital humanities is dangerously close to being oxymoronic. She thinks that the broad scope and focus on big data and macro analysis that the digital promotes has seemed to be at odds with that nuance and careful attention to detail that characterises more quote-unquote traditional humanities study. Drucker's work's indicative of the kind of scholarship that worries that digital tools might take the human, so things like the significance of gender, race, class, religion, sexuality. She worries that it risks taking the human out of literary or historical study. And doing that, taking the human out of those subject areas, would not only change the nature of the discipline really quite fundamentally, but also undermine the very reason for pursuing humanities research. There's not a lot of us that did literary study because we liked the data that it presented. But in the last decade, geographical information systems have become an increasingly important part of that discussion, and part of work on geography's role in literary studies, thanks in large part to work by scholars like David Cooper and Ian Gregory on projects like this one. This is a GIS map of a tour of the Lake District that was undertaken in the 1760s and written up as Thomas Gray's journal. This is from about 10 years ago now. I think the project was about 2008, but it was a really groundbreaking example of how to use GIS alongside texts. So GIS can offer really unique opportunities for spatial humanities study, not least thanks to its ability to integrate different kinds of sources and manage massive data sets. But it's got some significant limitations. Particularly, its resistance to what Sally Bushell calls the slipperiness on which literary geographies tend to thrive has been a real problem for literary scholars. Bushell's current project, called Creating a Chronotopic Ground for the Mapping of Literary Texts, largely rejects GIS as a means of mapping texts because of the way that a GIS risks flattening out complex understandings of geographical experience as they're described in and enacted by literary works. So people like Bushell worry that by mapping a text in this way, it removes any sense of what it is actually like to move through the landscape, which is the thing that the text itself is in a lot of ways, or in a lot of cases, most concerned with. So it really fundamentally disrupts what we might think of as the text ontologies. Bushell's work is part of a movement of scholars working in the spatial humanities who are developing alternative ways of mapping texts and historical human experience that are attempting to remain more faithful in some way to the texts or to the hermeneutics of the close reading traditionally associated with literary scholarship. So Bushell's project, for instance, has been working with things like Minecraft to think about different ways of visualizing literary space. So this example is a Minecraft version of the island in Treasure Island. And they've been using this mostly for educational purposes. You can move around the game spaces as if it's a kind of alternative way of reading the novel. But the limitations that scholars like Bushell have found in GIS might, I think, be, to a large extent at least, more a problem of semantics than the technology's capabilities. Anne Knowles, Levi Westerveld, and Laura Strom have suggested that disciplines which are new to GIS, like literary studies, have typically viewed it as a tool in the simple sense of a computer software that enables them to do new kinds of work. They note that the digital humanities community refers to the computer programs it uses and develops as tools, and those who create them as tool builders. Those authors suggest that by changing our terms, changing the way that we talk about GIS in the humanities, we can change the way that we understand and so use GIS. So they advocate instead for calling GIS a technology, a term which they think acknowledges that it was created during a certain period of time to solve particular problems. But more importantly, they go on to say that whereas tool is singular, technology can be plural. As a technology, GIS is not a single tool, but a bundle of techniques with many capabilities. Not a hammer, but a workbench, or more than a workbench, a workshop. So in referring to a GIS as a tool, literary scholars, like other digital humanists, have risked limiting the uses to which GIS might be put in analysing humanistic and particularly textual data. Conversely, if we think about GIS as an entire workshop, myriads of new possibilities start to open up. If a tool simply gives us the thing that we need to complete a specific predetermined task, a workshop encourages play and experimentation. And that's been really the first and maybe the most fundamental problem with a lot of literary GIS work. That tendency to treat GIS as a straightforward toolkit, as a kind of task-based workflow in some ways, rather than as an opportunity for experimentation. The second problem, I think, has been the tendency of digital humanists to treat GIS maps as evidence, rather than as text in themselves, so to assume that the map is providing an answer, rather than leading towards further questions. So I want to spend the second half of this showing you how we've engaged with these issues on the Geospatial Innovation project. So this project was funded by the Leverhulme Trust. It started in 2015. It technically finishes in December, but we've got a PhD student who's got another year to go. And one of its aims was to experiment with the tools that GIS offers in precisely those kinds of experimental ways that scholars like Anne Knowles believe are needed to develop literary GIS as a discipline that's both geographically and humanistically useful. So this project has been interested in how GIS and other geospatial technologies can be integrated alongside methods from corpus linguistics and literary studies in particular to create a new form of multi-scalar literary analysis. So our work here has demonstrated how close reading can be imbricated with distant reading and has at least tried to show how or that GIS can offer an unparalleled workshop in which to work creatively towards new forms of geographical literary analysis. So to do that, the project focused on a corpus of writing about the English Lake District. It's this region in the northwest of England. It was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site about 18 months ago. This is one of the most written about and painted landscapes in Britain, particularly since its discovery by tourists in about the mid-18th century. The corpus of Lake District writing has been put together over a series of projects at Lancaster over the last 6 or so years. It comprises 80 texts It's just over 1.5 million words, and it's made up of a variety of genres. There's a little bit of poetry, some almost excruciatingly terrible novels, but it's mostly what we might think of as non-fictional prose, so tourist guides and travel narratives. The earliest text is from 1622. It's the second edition of Michael Drayton's choreographical poem, Polyolbion. But most of the texts in the corpus are from the period in which the Lake District's popularity as a tourist destination really took off, so between about 1750 and 1900. So to analyse that corpus spatially, the texts were geoparsed using the Edinburgh geoparser. So that geoparser uses a two-stage process. It firstly identifies the place names in the texts, and secondly identifies them with mappable coordinates. And it's that data that can then be read into a GIS. So that process resulted in a little over 36,000 place name mentions in the Lake District. And that looks like this in the spreadsheet and that in the GIS. So you can see from the spreadsheet that we get given the place name location coordinates as well as a place name, but we also get given some of the text context to either side of the place name. So we can quite quickly begin to establish what's being said about a place, and that enables us to create more complex queries. So over the course of this project, we've become interested in how the concept of deep mapping, which ordinarily refers to a multimedia visualization, but how that might also constitute a methodology for literary analysis. So in other words, how deep mapping might be a practice as well as a technology. That approach recognizes that literary maps produced in a GIS have an analytical character in themselves. So that is, it understands the works in the corpus and the GIS maps we produce from them as interlinked texts. Marco Juven calls these kinds of visualizations meta texts. So the map itself becomes a text about a text. So these kinds of visualizations become kind of cartographic literary hybrids that require careful analysis in themselves in light of the geographical data and written works on which they're based. So the map should, or the GIS visualization should always be a starting point. It's not the end point. And it also, our argument throughout this project has been the GIS visualization should always lead you back towards more kind of traditional forms of humanistic interpretation. So in this kind of approach then, these sorts of visualizations become the basis of a new form of close reading. Even when they're based on big data, these kinds of toolkits can facilitate further analysis of specific texts. But more than that, by recognizing that the texts offer a guide to reading the map, at least as much as the map offers a guide to reading the texts, a deep mapping methodology can, we think, confront a central problem with literary GIS. So that is its inability to register personal or phenomenological responses to the landscape. So reading the map in light of the text, as well as the other way around, transforms the geographical certainties that are implied by the quantitative nature of a GIS into networks of conceptual possibilities that intertwine experience with topography and technology with interpretation. So together, the corpus texts and GIS technologies constitute that kind of workshop for analytical play that can lead to new ways of reading geography in written works. I want to finish up with one particularly experimental example from the Geospatial project, which started out as basically me going through and kind of clicking things until dots appeared on the map and working out what that might say about a certain text. And it was a different way of working to how we'd worked in the other book chapters. So rather than starting with a distant view, for the example that I wanted to show you, we focused on a particular place and kind of already vaguely knew what texts were going to be important. But the goal was to think about how different tools in the GIS might challenge the ways that we'd read what are actually really canonical texts. So this way of approaching that I want to talk through helps us to think about those interplays between close and distant reading, and also closeness and distance in kind of geographical terms, and proved to be a particularly useful site for thinking about playful ways of turning GIS toolkits into technologies for literary analysis. So we focused in on one particular spot in the Lake District. This is England's highest peak, Scafell Pike. It's not very high by kind of European or any other continental mountains terms, but for late 18th and early 19th century tourists in particular, those people who climbed Scafell and Scafell Pike, and there was not very many of them, this was the highest point that they would ever experience. This is an age where hot air balloons have just been invented, but they're not a popular experience. The kinds of top-down balloon view maps that you started to get in a couple of decades hadn't really taken off yet. So for people in this period who climbed to the top of Scafell Pike, it was a really seriously disrupting experience. And Scafell's really vertical. It's got some really quite dramatic cliffs. So standing on the top of Scafell Pike really messed around with people's senses of their sort of place, both sort of geographically and spiritually a lot of the time. So because of Scafell's kind of geographical or topographical challenges, it firstly wasn't climbed a lot in the early 19th century, not really until the 1830s. So the maps that I've got on that side don't represent a lot of mentions at all. There's 236 in total, and you can see from the density smoothed map on that side that the vast majority of those focus on the summit of Scafell Pike. The mountain also presented particular challenges for 18th century mapmakers whose difficulties in adequately representing verticality anticipated a lot of those that we've experienced in digital mapping technologies or experimentations with how to represent the vertical on a flat screen. So think about things like Google Earth and the fly-throughs that you can do in that. Scafell became a site that encouraged early cartographers and writers to reflect self-consciously on the intersections between the cartographic and the phenomenological. So, put really simply, early travellers were pretty astounded to find a mountain of Scafell's mass in this region. And that's because the maps of the time were really, really, really unhelpful. This is from William Hutchinson's History of the County of Cumberland, published in 1794. These are the mountains in the kind of more touristy bit of the Lake District. This is where Scafell should be. And I don't know if you can see that very well, but what it actually says is desolate and mountainous. So there's no need to map it because nobody was going to go there because all there was some very big mountains and very tall rocks. So imagine arriving to the Western Lake District if this is your reference point. What you think you're going to find is nothing. And what you actually find is a series of what for the late 18th and early 19th century reader are astonishingly big mountains. And even when maps did represent Scafell, they really struggled to capture what it was like to be there. So this is a much later example. This is from the 1860s. This is a guidebook written by the writer Eliza Lynn Linton, who's more famous for being the first salaried female journalist in Britain. And she described how difficult, or why Scafell was so particularly difficult to map. She said it was because the mountain seemed to actively wish to elude mapping. She noticed that the distances to it seemed to be continually shifting. And these engravings by her husband, William Linton, capture that sense of the way that the mountain's form seemed to change as the walkers approached. So what on earth do you do with that kind of thing in GIS, which wants to pin a geographical location quite specifically, when the mountain itself seems to want to not be pinned down in that kind of way? A lot of the authors in our corpus want to climb Scafell because of the view. They were not really so much interested in the arduous climb up, but they wanted to get to the top. They wanted it to be a nice day. They were very upset when it was not a nice day. It's often not a nice day on Scafell. There's a lot of very disappointed writers. But from Scafell's summit on a good day, you can command the most extensive view in the country. In this case, we weren't so interested in the location that our authors were talking about, but more how they were talking about it. So that question of how to use GIS meaningfully to interpret textual forms and structures is something that's been really tricky for literary GIS. But Scafell, I think, offered a really interesting opportunity to play around with it. So if our writer's main interest was in the way that they experienced the view, it followed that that's where a particularly fruitful source of inquiry might lie. So we performed some pretty basic viewshed analyses of Scafell and Scafell Pike. So the white here represents what you are supposed to be able to see from the summit of Scafell on a clear day in perfect conditions. So you can see or you're supposed to be able to see from the Cairngorms in the north, right the way to Snowdon in the south, over into Yorkshire and across to the Isle of Man. As quantitative results, these tell us really very little beyond what can be seen in ideal conditions. But when we approach these maps as the kinds of metatexts that I've been talking about, they offer a means by which we can begin to investigate spatial nuances that are often not so evident from an unguided reading of the text alone. So, for example, this is Harriet Martineau describing or offering a fairly typical description of the view from the summit of Scafell Pike in 1855. So she writes, "In opposite directions lie visible Lancaster Castle and the hills of Kirkcudbright, Wigton and Dumfries. Lancaster Castle and Carlisle Cathedral in the same landscape, and Snowdon and Criffel nodding to each other. Ingleborough in Yorkshire looking at Skiddaw over the whole of Westmoreland that lies between, with the Isle of Man as a resting place." Martineau's exhilaration at encountering this view is really clear. But what's less clear without the viewshed is the way that the written text mimics the experience of looking out from Scafell's summit. Conversely, of course, the viewshed reveals next to nothing about the actual experience of standing on top of a mountain. But by combining readings of those two texts, we can begin to generate something of a phenomenology of place. So the viewshed indicates that while it's possible to see over great distances from the summit of Scafell, the view is not a straightforward panorama. Instead, it's composed of a series of fragments disrupted by the mountain crags that prevent the eye from seeing everything in the landscape. The kind of pixelated view here is quite helpful for emphasizing that. And Martineau's sentences mimic that geographical experience. Those short clauses punctuated by her exclamation marks, her dashes, her commas, her semicolons, communicate something of the breathless awe that she feels looking out over this prospect. And her sentences aren't fully concluded by those exclamation marks either. Instead, along with those commas, and there's a semicolon in there somewhere, they disrupt the sentence, but they don't complete it. So the sentence, like the view itself, becomes one extensive, if fragmented, unit. So in this kind of way, we've used or tried to use GIS to create theoretical visualizations through which we might read our primary sources, while at the same time using the text to inform interpretations of the digital cartographies that we're using. And using that approach moves away from an understanding of GIS and other forms of cartographic visualization as objective, data-driven forms, and attempts to position them instead as geohumanist texts to be interpreted in light of subjective experiences. So it's allowed us to use quantitative approaches to uncover qualitative nuances and to combine distant views of the data with close analyses of it in both the map and the text to develop new readings of the text alongside new interpretations of the GIS maps. So I will wrap up there, but what I hope I've shown is that while new forms of geovisualization have a place in digital humanities, new technologies aren't necessarily the answer to the problem of literary GIS. Instead, by reinterpreting the role of GIS in literary study and coming to understand it as part of an interdisciplinary framework, both digital humanists and literary geographers can root GIS as an integral way of exploring humanistic understandings of space and place, and might, in the process, discover a new space for creative analysis. Thanks.